Today we are talking about the just transition. The reason we are focused on this issue is that the just transition become a buzzword, I will say, become a buzzword in Taiwan, especially when we talk about the climate issue. You can see even in the media, they are always there are also raise this concern and raise these words. And then moreover, when we talk about just transition, it's involved in a light speed from just a statement from the climate advocates or the some progressive scholars. It involves repeat to the kind of like a key pillars of officials net zero policy they proposed in this March. So there will be 12 key strategies they are working on, and the just transition is one of them. And then in addition to that, we also know the Congress and the EPA, they are working on to design a legal framework to implement the just transition in the upcoming Climate Change Response Act. But when we talk about those just transition in Taiwan, we find out that there's a huge knowledge gap in this topic, especially in Taiwan. So in order to support this fast development in this topic, we use this platform to invite Professor Minjun Cha to share her insight and experience in this topic. And Minjun Cha is the assistant professor at Urban Environmental Policy Department from the Occidental College. Minjun's research and teaching interests are in the area of climate justice, environmental justice, labor movement, and especially at the intersection between the climate and the labor movement. So especially regarding to the just transition topic, she just published several key reports since 2019, such as Roadmap to Incredible Low Carbon Future, 4 Pillars of the Just Transition, and the workers and the community in transition report of the Just Transition Listening Project. And recently, she just published a paper talking about the power policy and the prosperity of the just transition to highlight the principle and the political example to steer a just transition. And I remember a key recommendation from the Just Transition report is that when we talk about just transition, we need to go big, go wide, and go far. So what's the meaning of that? I think Minjun will explain during her speech. And the last and not least, I will say, the background of Minjun is environmental law. The reason that I want to highlight this issue is that I know there's a lot of important environmental lawyers among the participants. So I might invite you to ask some questions during the Q&A session. So that's a reminder for those environmental lawyers. Okay, before I hand over the floor to Minjun, I will just announce some housekeeping issue. Minjun will give a presentation about around 30 minutes, and then after that we have an important step is that we will take a group pictures after Minjun's presentation. Then I will invite Professor Qiu Hua-mei from National Sun Yat-sen University and Mr. Lin Yanting from the Environmental Rights Foundation to give a brief reflection as a kind of like a representative as a key stakeholders of this issue in Taiwan. Then I will open the floor to invite the audience to ask questions. You can ask a question by raise your hand. You can ask a question directly, or you can type your question in the chat box, and I will read it out loud. I think we might have around 50 minutes for the open discussion. So let's hope we can have a fruitful discussion. So I'll just hand over the floor to Minjun. Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Xiaowei, and thank you for moderating today's panel. And thank you all for being here today and for the invitation. I'm very happy to be in conversation together. And I just have a short presentation, and I hope we can have a long discussion. As I mentioned earlier to the conference, to the people who put together this today's talk, that I tend to talk really fast. So if ever I'm going too fast, please just flag and let me know, and I'm happy to slow down. So just an overview of what we'll be talking about today is, what is the idea of just transition? Why does transition have to be just? And then I'm going to talk about some work that I did with a colleague of mine, Manuel Pastor at USC, that looked at just transition at the state level in the US. So the first question I think is, why do we need an energy transition? And I'm sure that this is not anything new to folks here, but the latest IPCC report is very clear that global carbon emissions must drastically reduce. Nearly 90% of all carbon emissions come from fossil fuel extraction and use. And we cannot meet any kind of target of carbon neutrality by 2050 without ceasing the use of fossil fuels. So, it's not just that we need climate policy and that we need ambitious emissions reductions, but we need a transition away from fossil fuels. So, when we think about just transition, the idea of just transition, the point that I make often is that the first is that there has to be a transition. So we must stop the use of fossil fuels. We cannot meet our climate targets by continuing the use of fossil fuels. There will never be enough negative emissions technology or carbon capture to be able to meet our carbon emissions reductions goals. So we must have an energy transition away from fossil fuels. So then that brings up this idea of just transition. And the origins of just transition are with the late labor leader, Tony Mazzocchi, who, along with environmental justice leaders, called for something called the Superfund for Workers and Communities. And in the US, there's a program called the Superfund program, which places a tax on companies that do toxic activities. And then that fund is supposed to be spent to remediate the land that any kind of poison and pollution that comes from these industrial activities. So Mazzocchi's argument was that similarly, there should be a fund for workers that work in industries that are too toxic for society to continue, so that when we transition away from these industries, that the burden doesn't fall on the workers and communities. And what he meant by too toxic at the time was, he was a leader of the Atomic and Chemical Workers Association. But I think we could argue now that fossil fuels have become too toxic for society to continue. So as we move away from fossil fuels, we want to make sure that the burden of this transition doesn't fall on fossil fuel workers and communities. So in short, the idea of just transition is to understand and address the negative economic and social impacts to industrial transitions. So we know that we have to move away from fossil fuels for our energy transition to meet our climate goals. But we have to understand that there will be negative economic and social impacts to this transition. There are workers who are, who work only in fossil fuels. There are communities that are completely dependent only on the use of fossil fuels. So, assuming that we can just have a positive and a smooth transition, I think is not helpful. And rather, we should understand and address whatever negative economic and social impacts will come from this energy transition. And finally, it's fundamental to addressing this jobs versus environment false narrative. So the jobs versus environment false narrative is something that companies and corporations and firms really advance, which is the idea that, because environmental sustainability, because climate action is costly, the result is that people will lose their jobs because either plants will have to shut down or firms will have to reduce their costs, and they'll reduce their costs through workforce reduction. And in fact, we find that this is a false dichotomy, that we can have both a robust job creation and also a sustainable environment. And in fact, what this narrative that people have to choose between either a job or a clean environment does is that it essentializes workers down to their fundamental component only as their productivity and advancement of capital. So we actually ignore when we fall into this jobs versus environment false narrative is that we assume that workers can be sacrificed because they will also be exposed to this toxic pollution. So if the idea of just transition is that we eliminate this false choice between having a good job or having a clean environment and understand that it is through a clean environment that we can have good jobs. So some challenges to an energy transition as we start to think about how to implement and how to adopt just transition policies. So the first is the quantity and quality of jobs. So first, we need to have robust job creation. And in this sense, you hear often a lot about green jobs and the potential of green jobs. And the benefit to transitioning to and decarbonizing our systems is that there's a lot of things that need to be built. So it is new industry and new work, but we need to ensure that there is robust job creation such that as people start to lose their jobs, as we move away from fossil fuels, that it is not some job creation potential in the future, but that there is actually jobs for people to transition into. In the US, the job quality and renewable energy needs to meet fossil fuels. And I think this is true globally as well, and that fossil fuels pay higher wages. They often have more benefits, and they often are better jobs than what we see as renewable energy development jobs. But it's important, I think, to remember in this discussion that there's nothing inherently more just about fossil fuel jobs. It's just through workers' struggle that they have become good jobs. So similarly, worker struggle and political pressure can make renewable energy jobs into good jobs. So ensuring wage parity, benefits, and seniority transfer. So that's for existing workforces as they transition into a low carbon jobs, that they're not, starting from scratch. They're not starting from the bottom, and that their wages are comparable, as are their benefits. Reskilling and new skills training. We talk a lot about how a lot of green jobs will be created and how a lot of fossil fuel jobs will be lost, but there's very little discussion about what the linkage is in between those two. And some jobs can be reskilled for decarbonization, and some workers will need totally new skills training. So understanding kind of the skills landscape and where we can reskill workers and where new skills are needed. And then the final point about the quantity and quality of jobs is geographical alignment. So what we see is that most of the renewable energy jobs are being created in states in the US that have more advanced climate policy. So a lot of the solar jobs, for instance, are created in California. We have fossil fuel extraction here in California as well, but the other big areas in the country, like the Appalachia, the coal mining regions, the oil and gas regions, they're not doing as much solar and wind generation. So when we think about, where jobs are being lost and where jobs are being created, we need to ensure that jobs are being created where jobs are being lost. Another challenge to the energy transition is community supports and investment. So here in the US, many communities depend upon fossil fuel extraction for tax revenue that funds things like schools and basic infrastructure. So we just need to understand, what are the community supports that are needed and ensure that there is investment for long-term redevelopments of these regions so that they can have some kind of economic diversification away from fossil fuels. And finally, we need to ensure that there's equitable access to opportunities, address past harms, and meaningful participation for directly impacted stakeholders. So often the discussion of just transition really focuses on oil and gas and coal workers and oil and gas and fossil fuel regions. But we need to kind of zoom out, as was mentioned in the intro, about thinking more broadly and more holistically about where are the communities that have been harmed by the fossil fuel economy. So if we think about areas that have coal-fired power plants that have, suffered from the impacts of extraction, ensuring that those areas also have access to opportunities. So when we think about expanding out from just transition, it's not just the narrow focus on the fossil fuel economy, but thinking out more broadly about, what is the impact of the fossil fuel economy and how do we then mitigate those impacts? So I think this then goes to, why does transition have to be just? So we know that there has to be an energy transition. And I think the question often becomes, why do we have to think about social and economic issues as we think about, something that a lot of people consider just to be a technical issue of energy transition? And the first is that we have a history of unjust transition. When we think about previous industrial transitions, so here in the US, we had a period of globalization and deindustrialization, and many of those communities that used to have manufacturing, that used to have more industry, all of that went overseas, there was very little efforts and attempts to mitigate that economic transition. So this history of unjust transition, which I think is also replicated globally, creates a lot of suspicion and fear in communities that are facing an energy transition. So we have to understand that there is more than just a fuel source replacement. And understanding the history of unjust transition can help build broader support for energy policy and for decarbonization. Again, so understanding contestation, the role of identity, and the opportunity for social acceptance. A lot of fossil fuel regions, also globally, the identity of the region is tied to fossil fuels. So they are coal mining regions. And again, this is not to excuse or delay action, but understanding that there is more than just the technical aspect of it can help increase the opportunity for social acceptance. And increasing social acceptance will then decrease contestation. Am I talking too fast?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you small?
Yeah, I'll slow down.
Thank you.
Fortunately, this is just background. So the interesting things are still to come. And so, you haven't missed much. Okay, so again, the idea that we need to go much broader. So more inclusive and more just policy expands political coalitions and builds power to overcome fossil fuel opposition. Another thing that the recent IPCC report found is that, this idea of climate change and climate policy is a political issue, meaning that we have enough technology now to really do some deep decarbonization. But the reason why we're not doing it is because of political barriers. So the more inclusive and the more just our policy is, the broader a coalition that you can build to advocate and advance these policies, which then builds the power that you need to overcome fossil fuel opposition. So as we think about just transition and the energy transition as a political issue, we need to then think about, if it's a political issue, how do we build political power, and how do we advance and how do we overcome political opposition that will come from the fossil fuel industry? So when you have more just policies, when you have more inclusive ideas, that brings more people into a political coalition, which then builds more power. And finally, particularly as we are in the wake of a global pandemic, there's a need for more just societies. In the US, levels of economic inequality are at record. We are at record levels of inequality. And a lot of this, I think, is just kind of basic about people being concerned about whether or not they can put food on their table, whether or not they will have a job, and whether or not they will have any kind of economic security. So we can talk about emissions reductions all we want, but for people who have these very basic material considerations, we need to build a more just future. So decarbonization is actually our pathway to build a more just future. If we continue along the path that we are now, just extracting labor, extracting wealth, extracting resources, we are not going to build a more just future. And in fact, it is through the elimination of extraction in its totality that we will address the climate crisis. So we need more just societies, which is why the energy transition must also be just. So just a little background on some research motivations about why we undertook this research to look at just transition at the state level. So we wanted to contribute to empirical understandings of just transition that bridge the theory and practice gap. So there is, several strands of theoretical work on just transition, but there's very little empirical work that really looks at kind of what is happening on the ground in fossil fuel communities and what policies can be created from what we call the ground up. We wanted to center the experiences of advocates, decision makers, and residents in transition regions. And part of this is to expand out the idea of what we consider to be experts and knowledge creation. So, I think especially academics have a certain idea of what knowledge generation looks like and who experts are. And our argument is that, there is nobody who understands the needs of workers and communities in transition more than those that are actually going through it. So if we want to understand what are the challenges that these regions and these workers face, there is no model that can tell us as well as if we actually talk to people who are experiencing and who are facing this transition. So we did a series of semi-structured interviews to explore the following questions. How do you understand the just transition? As was mentioned earlier, it's a term that's becoming more popular, but I think that, people have different ideas of what just transition means. What informs your understandings of just transition? So why do you think just transition is something it is or isn't? And then how is power built in your state? And so when we think about power, we're really thinking about political power. So how is political power built at the state level in the 4 states that we looked at? So the chart on the right is a breakdown of the types of interviewees that we did, that we conducted. Most of our interviewees were from environmental or climate justice organizations, and then community-based organizations, and then worker-affiliated organizations. We did 32 semi-structured interviews. In addition to the interviews, we did background, economic, and organizing capacity research and policy landscape. So we really wanted to understand kind of what policies existed in these states, what were the economic considerations, did they have high rates of unemployment, what kind of sectors were, would make up the majority of their local economies. And then the organizing capacity is we think about what is the nonprofit NGO landscape in each state? Is it quite robust? Are there things that are missing, that are lacking? What is the state of civil society in each state? So we chose California, Kentucky, Louisiana, and New York. So we wanted a comparison of extractive states, so states that extract fossil fuels, which is California, Kentucky, and Louisiana, and then non-extractive states like New York. So what are non-extractive states? What does their climate policy look like, considering that they won't have to deal with some of the negative economic consequences that come from ceasing the use of fossil fuels? So we also wanted to have a mix of political landscape ranging from very conservative, so states that had very conservative state legislators and governors, which is Kentucky and Louisiana. They are kind of the states that you think of when you think of kind of the stereotypical conservative in the United States. And then those that are seemingly progressive, which is California and New York. And I say seemingly progressive because while they are, of course, more progressive than Kentucky and Louisiana, California, for instance, issued something like 1,500 new permits for fracking and oil and gas wells just in the last year. So on the one hand, they have, this reputation as being a very green and climate-friendly state, and at the same time, they are increasing oil and gas extraction. And we wanted a mix of climate policy that ranged from ambitious to California and New York. So up until recently, New York had the most ambitious climate policy in the US, which totally decarbonized their electricity system and had a net zero target of 2040. And California was the first to kind of really go for an ambitious climate policy. They have since been, outdone by other states that followed, but they were really the first to have a ambitious climate policy. And then the states of Kentucky and Louisiana are what we consider to be hostile to climate policy. So not only do they not have ambitious climate targets, but they are hostile in that both states have sued the federal government to stop climate action. They are actively against an energy transition. So just a quick overview of our findings. So we found that there is indeed a disconnect between literature and lived experience. So the way that scholars really think and talk about just transition is very different from those that experience just transition on the ground. We found also that the challenges to transition are beyond policy. So it's not just a legislative barrier that is stopping transition to stopping an energy transition, but that there are other social and economic considerations. We found also that power is more than policy. So often when we think about what makes a coalition powerful, it's their ability to pass legislation. But we found actually that there are more considerations to power and power building than with legislation and policy. And as social safety net, what we call social supports, helps advance energy transition, which is what we call a transition to justice. So again, ensuring that the society is more just actually helps advance an energy transition because you are helping to meet people's material considerations and needs, which then reduces opposition to an energy transition. So for our first finding is on, this question of what does just transition mean to you? And we did find a disconnect between literature and lived experience. So this quote is from an organizer in the Eastern Kentucky region. And Eastern Kentucky is where a lot of the coal mining occurs in Kentucky. And he states, I could go out to the street or I could go to Walmart. I could stop 25 people. None of them would know what just transition means. You stop anybody and ask them what war on coal means. They know that. It's like, man, progressives tend to hide what they're doing and then create a language that's only for the elite. And I think that's what we've done. Everybody goes through a transition, right? You're getting a divorce, it's a transition. you lose your job, it's a transition. We know this terminology, but the whole idea of a just transition, meaning fair, more equitable, thoughtful, green, none of that really resonates. And so it's basically a language made up by elites for elites to keep regular people out of the debate. And I think this quote is very powerful because it is true that, when we talk about just transition, people just kind of talk about just transition and assume that everybody, exactly as he's saying, assume that people understand that that means fair, it means equitable, green, all of those things, when none of those terms actually appear in the term just transition, right? There is some indication because there is just, but as he points out, transition from what, right? People have said then a just energy transition, which again, I think is terminology that has a role, but the idea that, you could have widespread acceptance that just transition or a just energy transition would mean certain things is not really reflected from people who are on the ground. In contrast, though, if you say something like the war on coal, that really, you can immediately imagine what that means, that, it is a war on coal mining. These words also spark some kind of feeling that people feel under attack who live in coal regions. And so, it is a really important point, I think, that we can get too caught up in issues like terminology and divorce that from the political organizing and work that needs to be done to really bring people on board with these ideas. And the last point here is that I think is really important is that while there is opposition to the term just transition, it is not an opposition to an energy transition. If you see what the person is saying, that they're saying you can't come in here and say just transition and assume that people know what you mean. But it is not saying that there shouldn't be an energy transition. So I think this is really important to keep in mind, that while there could be opposition to this idea that you kind of parachute into communities and expect them to understand what you're talking about, I think there is opposition to that idea, but not necessarily opposition to an energy transition, which means that there is an opportunity for people to then build and open up a discussion and dialogue that can build a broader, more powerful coalition. So our second finding is that, there are challenges that go beyond policy. And here is a quotation from a Kentucky resident that says, "We have spent many years trying to figure out what are we shifting it to, right? So what are we shifting when we say energy transition? What is the transition?" And I feel like we're now at this point where we kind of have it figured out, but we lack a lot of the capacity, both financially and just, people capacity to implement it in a way that I feel like could be really impactful and really powerful. But I think now, our efforts really need to turn more inward and think about how do we meet people in the region where they are, and then bring them into this and bring them along with us, instead of just recreating this extractive model of taking a lot from them without listening and without trying to help them do what they want to do. And I think, so basically what this interview is saying is that it's not just that you have the policy and then everything sorts itself out, right? How is it implemented? What do we need? What tools do we need? What financial capacity, what people capacity do we need to actually implement this energy transition? So again, when we think about going broad and going deep, it's not just that we have decarbonization goals, but really thinking through what do we need to implement those efforts on a regional level, right? On a community level. So understanding really what else do we need besides a policy change and a policy shift, and what do organizations and what do communities need to help them actually implement and actualize an energy transition. Then again, along the same line, the next finding is that power is more than policy. So this is from a Louisiana organizer, and they state, "My definition of a win now is watching power be built, being able to see power built. For the first time, 100+ groups across 5 states said, I'm going to be in charge of my own destiny. I'm going to put down what I want to see. I'm not going to wait for somebody to give it to me. We're going to declare what we want and we're going to move it together. And that is power building. We're building a movement. We're not building a piece of policy. So what they're referring to is that the 5 states across the Gulf South have come together and created a Green New Deal for the Gulf South. And what this person is saying is that, it's not just about the legislation again. It's not just about the decarbonization goal, but really what infrastructure do you need to put in place? What social infrastructure do you need to kind of ensure that there's a broader movement and a broader movement towards justice? So, the first step was that these groups across the 5 states saw themselves in a collective identity. And once they saw themselves in a collective identity, they could then think about what do we need for our region, which is a broader frame than if they were by themselves and trying to think about what do we need for our community or what do we need for our state. So what they're talking about is that as we build out social infrastructure, we can build out, again, what the policy and the power that we need to actually advance these issues. And by building the social infrastructure, we can think more broadly and more bigly. We can think more broadly and more ambitiously on what we can actually achieve. And finally, social safety net helps advance an energy transition. So again, social supports help the more we transition to a just society overall, actually helps advance an energy transition. And this particular quote is very US specific because we have this healthcare system that is broken and doesn't cover anybody. But basically what the Kentucky Advocate said was, well, I tend to think first about the energy sector, but it is clearly not. We're not just thinking about the energy sector, right? And so over the last 5 years, what I have learned is that the single most important just transition policy that has actually improved the quality of life for Kentuckians has been the Affordable Care Act, without a doubt. So the Affordable Care Act was a policy that was passed during the Obama administration that is a way for people to get health insurance, not throughout their employer. So in the US, most people who have health insurance receive it through their employer. So if you lose your job, you lose your health insurance. So again, in an energy transition, there will be job loss amongst fossil fuel workers. So what this advocate is saying is that, having this policy in place that ensures that you don't lose health insurance if you lose your job actually is an important just transition policy, because it means that if you lose your job because of an energy transition, you won't lose your health care. And this goes to the broader idea of, again, more just societies, reduces opposition. So before, the idea that you would lose your job still creates quite a lot of panic and concern, understandably. But as we start to remove some of these things, like as we start to remove tying health insurance to employers, as we start to make a more robust social safety net and be able to help people who are transitioning, help shelter them and move them through without too much economic hardship, that then decreases opposition to an energy transition. So again, thinking more broadly about decarbonization, not just being emissions reductions, but what are the things that we need in place to help advance policy that is ambitious for decarbonization and can also reduce opposition to an energy transition. So some key takeaways, and then these are my final slides, and then I'm happy to take questions. So an empirical study shows that differing visions of just transition are not fatal, but coalitions must develop a shared vision. So people don't have the same idea of what just transition means, and that's generally okay. But what they do need is a shared vision. So it may mean different things to different people, but if you are not creating a shared vision, then the coalition cannot advance. Change requires not just power building, but also understanding how to deploy power. So power must be shared within a coalition for success. So again, I've been talking a lot about power building, which we need, but it's not just power building, but how do you then use that power, right? In what arena do you think that there is the most probability for change? Sometimes it's at the state level, sometimes it's at the international level, right? Thinking about how can you use power in an international negotiation, for instance, or sometimes it is at a very hyper local level. So what administrative changes can you make in your local jurisdiction that actually will have some kind of difference and make some kind of change? So not just building power, but then understanding how do you then use that power? And then power must be shared within a coalition for success. So if you think about power both externally and internally, any misbalance can destabilize your coalition. Cultural organizing is as important as political organizing. So again, understanding the social context of fossil fuels can help reduce opposition. So the quote that I read from the Eastern Kentucky resident that talked about meeting people where they're at, that's the phrase that we think about for cultural organizing. So understanding that people have different visions and different familiarity with both climates and energy transition. So understanding the cultural context of fossil fuels is as important as political organizing. The idea of what we call wins, so what is a success, are more than legislation. They also require power building and movement infrastructure. So thinking again about building social infrastructure for long-term gain can be considered to be a success, even if there isn't a policy outcome that comes from this work and these efforts. And finally, here in the US, we find that state-based efforts are essential to advancing climate justice. We have a complete stalemate at the federal level. We will not have any kind of ambitious climate policy at the federal level. So we have to focus on advancing as much ambitious climate policy at the state level. And I think this, again, is a lesson that can be applied more broadly, that there are things that can be done at national and international levels, but there are also many things that can be done at local and state and regional levels. And so we should really be thinking more broadly about where can change occur and where are our efforts best targeted to advance the most ambitious climate policy. So in conclusion, just energy transition will be complicated, expensive, and require political will, but inaction is not an option. So you often hear a lot about the cost of an energy transition, but I think it's very important to keep in mind how much we will have to pay if we have unmitigated climate change, right? That cost is astronomical and untenable. But so putting things in context, of course, it will be complicated, and of course, it will require political will. But I say these things not to dissuade or discourage, but just so that we have an understanding of the challenge that we face so that we can then respond accordingly. Addressing past harms, meaningful engagement in decision-making in the present, and creating inclusive and equitable opportunities for the future will create a pathway to a just low-carbon future. So, ensuring that there is robust social dialogue so that, there are not hierarchical processes that are replicated, but that those that are facing transition have a meaningful stake, both in the conversation and in the outcomes, is key to a just transition. We also have to think about what harms have been caused by the fossil fuel economy and ensure that those past harms are addressed. So we're not just thinking about what happens in the future, but also thinking about how can we redress harms that have already occurred. And again, I feel like I'm a little bit of a broken record, but the more just policies and the more just agendas we can have, the more we can advance a just energy transition. And so again, the important to use this opportunity to use an energy transition to a more just society. So we really can use this moment to think about how can we make society more just. And through these pathways of equity and justice, we will meet our ambitious decarbonization goals. So thank you very much. I apologize for talking too quickly at the beginning, and I'm happy to kind of revisit or go over things that I may have glossed over too quickly. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks Minjun for her presentation. And so let's give her a big hand virtually. You can type some information, some symbols in the chat box to show your gratitude. And before we go into the Q&A session, so I would just highlight two key points. for you to consider your questions. The first thing is that take from the Bingjing's presentation, you can see that the just transition is about to build out a new kind of coalition. So there's a lot of audience are from the environmental NGO. So that's we can take this point to think how to do that, how to implement, how to build out a new environmental new kind of coalition when we talk about the net zero policy in the upcoming month. The second thing is that Minju also talk about the safety net, the social safety net as a key important issue as an enable condition for the just transition. Like IPCC already said, the social safety network is a key measures for the climate adaptation. But when we talk about just transition, we also have to think about do we have a success kind of like some stable social safety network to help us to facilitate the just transition. Now we hand over the microphone to Professor Cho Hua-mei to give some brief reflection. Okay.
Okay. Many thanks to Professor Chat. This is a very well organized and inspiring talk, and I think this is in such we are in a very critical moment, and in which we need more people from different area and to work together, and also to make successful case to be diffusionable around the global society. So I think I'd like to thank Professor Chart as the beginning of my short recommendation. And I think first of all, I'd like to say that this is a very thoughtful and well designed comparative studies, and I think it's also really important to have such research which give the labor and the grassroots organization and community residents have the chance to have a say in the transition. And so as we know from Professor Chart, you have collect research material from more than 100 interviewees. This is really amazing, but it's also makes your research very convincing, and to have very solid research material to support your argument. So I'd like to also I also like to congratulate to your very successful research. And here, and I have some question, and it's not much relate to your main arguments. It's more about my concerns, and I'd like to learn more from what you have found in the 4 states in the United States. And my first question is about the states comparison. And as you, I think it's a well designed and well selection, and you have these 4 states to be the to conduct for you to conduct these comparison studies. And but I found it seems quite interesting that we have California and New York states. They have more politically, in political landscape, they are more progressive, and so they also have more ambitious policy in terms of just transition. And so how much or how much or how you weight the fact of the if the state have the extractive industry in the comparison. And this is my first question, and is the how the trade union of all this is extractive industry responds to the just transition in current periods. And my second question is more about coalition building. I think it's really important issue for us to remind us that coalition building and to make the coalition promotes a just transition. The stronger it seems to me, the stronger the coalition have been built, and we will have more strong social forces to shape pathway of energy transition or just transition to be more socially fair and equally transition pathway. So, but when you talking about coalition building, what stakeholders do you exactly means, and do you include like government official and all kinds of or how difficult and also how difficult is the building coalition building, and are there certain conflicts between different stakeholders such as environment group and trade between environmental group and the trade union from extractive industry, how to reconcile this kind of conflicts between them. And my third question is about social dialogue. I think it's really important, especially you mentioned that some actually ordinary people have no idea what is just transition. And I'm quite agree with you that we need to, it doesn't mean they against the transition or energy transition, but we need to realize or to understand their thoughts, and then have more social dialogue and to build social consensus between different stakeholders, including the ordinary people and the public. So I'm wondering, in your study, what strategy or what method the environmental group or the key player of the coalition you mentioned, what strategy they adopted to do this public the social dialogue. And my I think I only have 5 time, but still have 2 questions. Okay, let me try to speak quickly. And my first question is in recent environmental justice study, we have more discussion about address the importance of the potential of the suffering for the community who's suffering from environmental justice, the potential of them to play a key role in the sustainability transition, or say just transition. And I'm wondering, how do you bridge this environmental justice? I know it's also one of your research major. So I'm wondering, how do you bring this environmental justice to this need research in just transition? And my final question is, as a researcher, and this is also a question of mine, because I'm also conduct research in this area. So I'm wondering, how do you consider or identify yourself as a bridge broker in this transition process? Okay, that's all. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think Professor Cho already raised 5 questions, so maybe Mingjun can respond to that first, and then we will invite Yanting for another round of the reflection. Then I will open it to the floor for those who already raised your hand, or you type your questions in the in the chat box. Okay, so Minjun, okay.
Well, great. Thank you so much for those comments. They were really wonderful and a lot to think about. And your questions are so important and things that I think about a lot. So I really appreciate your questions and your comments. So the first question of how do trade unions respond to just transition, I think it's a spectrum. So there is another initiative that I am involved with through Cornell University's Worker Institutes that works only with unions. It's called Labor Leading on Climate. And so it's just unions looking at climate action and doing political advocacy for climate, but interestingly, not in multi-issue coalitions. So just amongst labor unions. And they have what they consider to be, I think they call it, they are a coalition of the willing. So they are only unions that both support ambitious climate policy, but also agree not to agree not to, I guess, hinder climate policy for the sake of saving jobs. But they are, of course, very concerned about jobs that will affect their members. There's also a very interesting trend amongst union workers that the younger workers see themselves as more than just a union worker. So older workers, their identity is very tied to the union. So their concerns are the concerns of the union. And we found that younger workers have more concerns like racial justice, climate change, actually student loan debt in the US. And so they want more of that political advocacy from their union. And the last thing that I will say about this is that unfortunately, though, on the national level, the national labor unions and labor federations are largely absent in the climate discussion. Interestingly, the coal miners union has accepted that there needs to be a just transition, but I think that's probably because the coal industry is already in decline. So they are already, that has nothing to do with climate policy, largely due to the abundance of natural gas. So in some ways, they are already in a declining industry, so they are more accepting of a just transition. But the big national building trades union, for instance, they're really not in favor of climate action. But I think it is very different at the state and local level. So another reason why we try to really encourage state and local activity. Your second question is, what do we mean by coalition? This is a great question, especially when we're thinking about labor leading on climate is technically a coalition. It's just a coalition of different unions. And we kind of think more generally of coalitions as multi-stakeholder, multi-interest coalitions. And some of them actually do engage with government agencies. I think the challenge is that often the target of the coalition is the public sector. So the efforts of the advocacy coalition are directed towards either the state legislature or a state-led agency, which then hinders the participation of those agencies. So I think we think of coalition as broadly as possible. So more than two, maybe like 2 is a partnership, 3 is a coalition. And then how difficult is it to build? This is such a great question, and I think could be a whole nother big research project. Some of them are very easy, and we found that if there's a very specific need or a very specific challenge, then people can come together really easily. So for instance, trying to ban oil and gas drilling in Los Angeles County, very discreet. There was a moment where they had a new set of legislators that came in that were very open to it, and also given the climate considerations. So it came together quite quickly because they had a very discreet and specific goal. Whether that coalition then lasts to then take on other issues, I think remains to be seen. The more difficult coalitions are the ones, exactly as you mentioned, that have actors that have competing interests. So, there's a lot of discussion and a lot of efforts to make labor climate coalitions, and some of them are very successful, and then some of them seem to stay together until it gets to an issue like carbon capture and storage or nuclear or some issue that both would threaten their members' employment, but also is something that is, the environmental groups are very against. So nuclear is one that causes lots of problems. But then there are others that, that can kind of, in Illinois, for instance, they found a way to kind of come together to pass this very ambitious climate policy. And I think their compromise was that they wouldn't build new nuclear, but they wouldn't advance the shutdown of existing nuclear. So sometimes they can come to compromise that way. And then what strategies or methods for social dialogue? This is, again, such a great question. And I honestly wish that more funding agencies in the US and internationally would fund social dialogue because it's very expensive and time consuming, and there's really no short way around it. So from what we saw, the best was relational organizing. So someone, you go talk to them, they maybe bring their friend to the next meeting, and you build really from the ground up. What we found was that when outside entities come in and try to force social dialogue, one, you often only get what we call the elites, so policy experts or professional nonprofit workers. That is the coalition that kind of comes together. But when you have something that is very community-based, local residents that are organizing against a smelt plant or something like this, then you actually see more organic and I think stronger organizing. So relational organizing is one way. I think that it needs to be something that is funded through the civil society sector. So organizing in and of itself is very often not funded. Policy campaigns are funded, those more kind of discrete, professionalized efforts are funded, but organizing in and of itself is very rarely funded. And I think it is an area that we did in our broader report that really does deserve funding. And then the last question about the potential of environmental justice communities. I think it is a really important issue and why we center the transition to justice. So environmental justice and climate justice communities and organizations have really been at the forefront, both for ambitious climate policy, but also just ambitious climate policy. So what I often say is that, most of the money goes to these big traditional green organizations. And what they should do is just then give that money to the environmental justice and climate justice organizations, because they receive a tiny fraction of the funding, but they are extremely effective. And so I think the challenge is that they are often very small and under-resourced, whereas a big green organization, they have a multi-million-dollar budget. So the challenge, I think, to environmental justice in the just transition discussion is a resource constraints. And then, it is, I think, very easy to kind of conceptualize a coal miner and, trying to think about what happens to a coal miner as we stop mining coal. I think it's much less easy to think about a refinery community. Like there's a community in California called Richmond, California. They have an Exxon refinery. It catches on fire like every other month. That doesn't necessarily come to mind, though, when you think about just transition. And so I think that is kind of one challenge of understanding the implications of the fossil fuel economy, that it goes beyond just workers and extraction to the harm that has been caused because we burn fossil fuels.
So thanks, Minjin's reply, and she just Minjin also talked about the refinery issue, and we will have Li Yanting from the Environmental Rights Foundation, who was focused on the petrochemical industry and the climate law issue. So I will just invite him to give some reflection. Okay.
Many thanks for the Minjin's sharing. And I come from an NGO, is environmental law NGO in Taiwan, and I just want to share about some background in Taiwan. The first is our legislature is discussed the climate law legislation. So we just talk about the definition about the just transition. So I think the first is about the stakeholder, which is the stakeholder in the just transition. We also talk about the laborers and the fishermen and the farmers and about indigenous people, because in energy transition we also face this challenge with them, and also about the communities. So I think Another thing is about the funding. How about the just transition funding? We think we can have their sourcing. The first we think about we can from the carbon fees or carbon tax we can use this funding from to use the just transition. But we also have a question and a thinking and discuss to think about this funding, we have to give anything we have to divide from the big company and the small and medium company about the funding. We have to. I just have this question for the Minjun about the USA. Is anything policy about the just transition funding? Different from the big company and the small and medium company, because we think the bigger company have their capacity to think about their just transition and how to help help their workers to find the green jobs. And another thing is about just about the energy transition, because in Taiwan we also have some power plant. We just from face the uh, energy transition. Just in your research case in the Formosa Plastic, they also have the case in the Louisiana, and they also have a big company in Taiwan. It's a big chemical company, and they also have a big power plant to from coal to the gas. And we also discuss with their union and their company to think about when the energy transition and how to cooperate with them and to think about when this power plant disclosure and they face energy transition, how to face this challenge. But I think I also want to know more experience from you to think about how local government to cooperate with the uh, community or with their union or with the central government. Because I think in Taiwan, the first thing about the definition we don't know. I think many central government or local government, they don't know their meaning and they don't know how to do that. And many discussion and many viewpoint we just from the labor, and I just want to know about their experience from you. Thank you.
Okay, the first question is about the funding, and the second question is more about how to make the workers in the among the all those carbon intensive industry can on board to have this kind of dialogue. So, Minjun, so can you respond to those two questions? Yeah.
Yes, and thank you for your comments and questions. I think they're really important. So the first about just transition funding, yes, companies should pay a lot, like they should pay a lot. Particularly now when we see that oil and gas companies are having record-breaking profits because of the high price of gas. And there is precedent for this idea. Again, what we call the Superfund site is that the Superfund is that in agreement for a permit to have a polluting industrial activity, you agree to put aside a certain amount of money to then clean the land after you are finished. So similarly, as these fossil fuel companies are making billions and billions of dollars, creating a lot of climate chaos, they should take some of those profits and then spend them to help workers and communities transition. Politically, it is very difficult. They don't want to pay. So one way that we've thought about it is that, okay, if they won't proactively pay, what are other ways that we can get that funding? So one is eliminating all subsidies. So maybe you cannot proactively take money from the fossil fuel sector. But certainly you can stop government money from going there. And at least, you know, in the US, it's about $4 billion a year that goes in tax subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. So if we just stopped those subsidies, we would have $4 billion that we could then use for, you know, transition programs. I think, you know, the question of big or small, I think that, you know, if we think about, like, for instance, gas station owners that tend to be smaller, obviously, I think that is a much difficult and much more economically onerous place. But some place like Shell, Exxon, BP, like trillions of dollars they could give. And interestingly, Shell even has a just and equitable energy transition point on their website, which never actually talks about either justice or transitioning away from fossil fuels. So I think that, you know, thinking, and also because so many discussions get hung up on how to pay for it, you know, people will, I think it's another way for climate delay and denial to say, I think your idea is great, but I just don't know where we would get the funding for it. And I think the way around those conversations is that there's never a shortage of money, there's only a shortage of priorities. So when it comes to war, for instance, we have unlimited funding in the United States for war. So rather than getting into those discussions about, okay, maybe this or maybe that, you know, then I think we're having discussions on somebody else's timeline and timetable. I think instead we should change the discussion to not just how do we afford it, but how much money can we get and make that number as big as possible. And then we can think about where can that money come from. But instead we are kind of forced into these small discussions about, okay, now I have to figure out how to fight for $5 million, rather than saying, we need $500 million, here's how we can get it. So I think thinking through those things, I think, are also maybe a bit quicker than trying to implement things like a carbon tax, which I just think is then a really large political struggle that I'm not sure how much revenue it would raise in the long term, at least in the US. So trying to think about ways, or I often think of also oil and gas companies as they get new permits, if there can be a fee associated to new permitting, so that there's at least some revenue that is coming from these activities. Little ways that you can think about putting in mini severance taxes or something that can then actually capture some cost from extraction. And then I think I heard two questions of one, how to get extractive workers, but then also how do local governments interact with central governments. The best approach, honestly, for extractive workers is within the workforce. Again, somebody like me going to talk to a coal miner is not going to have any kind of impact. In fact, I grew up in Wyoming, which is a coal mining state, and I went to the Powder River Basin, which is a coal mining region, and nobody would talk to me. So, and I grew up there. So I feel like the best way is really this relational organizing. I think the other way that can be done, though, is that we have to show that there is something to transition into. Right now, we are just having these theoretical discussions about how if you just trust us, we will then take care of your needs. But, you know, then that comes with the history of unjust transition, which is, why would I believe that you would take care of me this time when you didn't take care of me the previous time? And so I think, one, relational organizing, and two, having concrete programs and actions for transition. Like, here is the worker transition package. We will support your income for 3 years as you train or go to school or rethink your career. We will help you with housing assistance, you will have health insurance, and you will not lose your pension contributions. Then I think you have a very different discussion. Now we're saying, just maybe you can install solar, maybe you can, you know, but there's no, so I think that also helps. And then in terms of the local and state, this is also something that we think a lot about, and I think is also very challenging. So what we kind of thought about was, what do local governments do that is very good? And then what do you need the central state for? So we thought the federal government really has resources on a level that local governments cannot amass. And also they have more coordination between different agencies. So Department of Labor, Department of Transportation, housing, things that we may have to consider. But the local economy is much better apt at understanding what industries can be attracted, right? Like, a federal central planning is not as helpful as local planning in terms of understanding the potential for economic diversification. I think it's also better for understanding the specifics of the workforce and communities at the local level. So what is appropriate for Los Angeles is not going to be appropriate for Louisville, Kentucky. And so you do need local government and local interactions so that you are tailoring your transition programs for the challenges of the local administration. And then there are small things that local administrations can do that happen more easily and more quickly than central state. So for us, we saw some regulatory changes that could happen at the local level that would either raise revenue for oil and gas from oil and gas activities, or kind of accelerate the timetable for shutting those down. For instance, banning all new oil and gas drilling in Los Angeles County was a local ordinance. And that has a much bigger effect than if we are trying to do something at the federal level, because that permitting process is at the local level. So trying to understand kind of at the local administrative level, what are the levers for change? And then what is best suited at a central state level? So ultimately in the US, for instance, we have to have some kind of central climate policy because there are too many states that will never do anything on climate change. So we need some kind of floor. It can't all be done at the local level. So the focus on the states is that as we have hopefully some mini revolution at the federal level, as we wait for that, we will still be able to have some kind of impact and advance towards our climate goals.
Okay, so thanks, Minjun, for the response. And let's open the question to the floor because we only have 20 minutes left. So the things I will run for the next 20 minutes is that I will read out the first two questions typed in the chat box and ask Minjun for her response. Then I will open to the floor to invite like the Dr. Wei Chen and the other people who want to ask questions directly. Then I will read out the question typed in the chat box by the Wan Ting and the Zhu Wenning 博士. So that's the way I'm trying to do that. And then if we have additional time left, I will invite some you student, the participant younger than 25 years old, to raise your questions. So the first question we see in the chat box is from Ni. He is I don't know it's he or she, but he would like to know whether there's a different result among those interviews conducted in the 4 states. So that means the research shared by Minjun. And also a related question is from the rebuttal, maybe from Thailand or from other. I don't remember which country you are from, but they are also asked about any effective policy recommendation to be delivered to those conservative state, which was more maybe against the energy transition issue. So I think those two questions are quite related. So Minjun, can you share some response for those two questions? Okay.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that the challenge of conservative states and interests and opposition to climate change cannot be overstated. So there are some things that, again, which why I think that ultimately we need some kind of national and ideally international climate policies so that there can at least be a floor. I think one way to go about it is, again, trying to not have a one-size-fits-all approach. So just transition will look different in different areas. And even in the very conservative parts of Kentucky and Louisiana, there are still opportunities to advance these conversations. For one, coal mining is a very dangerous and very hazardous industry. So, but it is the only industry in a lot of these regions. So understanding that, there's a long history that brought people to where they are. And so understanding that not as a way, again, to excuse climate action or climate delay, but as a way to kind of approach people and do the cultural organizing that's necessary to then bring people on board with the idea of an energy transition. And then, to be honest, there's just a part that is just power building, that there will always be people that are opposed and who will try to, and there will always be contestation. But that's why we need to build power on the other side so that eventually there will just, we will win. So I think that there are limits I don't agree necessarily with this approach that there has to be bipartisanship and kind of agreement across all fronts. I think there is work to be done to kind of reach people that are reachable, and then there are those that aren't reachable. So then I think the idea is that you just need to neutralize them and help and advance your own agenda.
我觉得这种不太好切的。我是学文，有吗？
Okay.
Did I
Thank
answer
you.
both, did I answer both
Sure.
questions or sorry?
Yeah. Okay. You can continue. Okay. Okay. So we will have next round for the questions. So we will invite the Dr. Wu Yichen to ask your question. And the next one is the Mr. Su Yan Zhao. So you can prepare for your questions. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, hello, Professor Chao. Thanks for your presentation. And I'm particularly curious about your slide 16 about the key takeaway. In the first line, you talk about just transition require the power building. And I assume that based on the evidence you provide in the previous slide, it's talk about the local empowerment, that the inclusive process to engage with the local resident. So it has implied for the bottom-up approach. But in the next sentence, you stress the importance of a state-based effort to advance the climate justice. So which is a strong imply for the top-down approach. And as you has mentioned in the past 3 minutes, you're talking about a strong federal government will to action of the justice transition. So these two are actually contradict with each other in some ways. And I can understand these two suggestions are a response for the market-led economy of the US themselves. But how do you deal with this internal contradiction in your slide 16, that the bottom-up approach of a top-down approach, and which is also the question raised by another people in the chat box. And also, how does this suggestion implies for Taiwan, which is the government has more power, but the government has fewer or smaller tax base compared with the United States federal government? Thanks. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Yeah. So when I say state-based climate efforts, we mean that in as opposed to just a national level strategy. So looking at where you can create change at the state level versus always trying to do federal advocacy, which is what the environmental movement in the US has largely focused on for the last couple of decades. So not that the state should impose per se, but where advocacy should be targeted at the state level rather than the federal level. And so the bottom up, certainly power building comes from the bottom up. And so we think that coalitions and organizing must happen at the local level and amongst communities. And then where that power is deployed is where we think about whether it comes at the state level or the federal level. And the second point that I'll say about this is that I think also there is this idea of non-reformist reforms that is used by abolitionist scholars and activists in the US, which is the idea that we have these systems that are oppressive and create injustice. And so how do you advance justice in an unjust system? And the idea is that, some scholars would say you need a whole-scale revolution and you need to tear down all these systems. But the other idea is that this idea of non-reformist reforms. So how do you begin to reform the system within the system, but that doesn't continue the system? So for instance, a just transition program that is administered by the state still is in the state, right? It still is state apparatus, it still is state policy. But what that program looks like can then begin to change either the infrastructure or change the systems such that they become more just. So a proactive just transition policy that allows people to leave an extractive industry and go to regenerative work that is still within the system, but it is a non-reformist reform in that it doesn't continue the practice of extraction. So I think, ideally power is built bottom up. I think that there are levers that you can look at from a top down, but yes, I didn't mean to have it seem as if we were advocating for a top down approach. More that where should advocacy and power be deployed at what level of administration. And then thinking about this idea of non-reformist reforms. So what policies can we pass within existing institutions that actually do advance a more just agenda?
Okay, so I think
Okay, thank you.
yeah, I think Mr. Su Yanzhao also have a related question. So Mr. Su Yanzhao, you can ask your questions directly.
Hi.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
in fact, my question is a little like Dr. Wu mentioned, because my idea is about in your presentation, I can less very clear the combination of bottom-up and the top-down approaches. And I'm just thinking, because the thinking of these two approaches may have a very different aspect, and you can get a lot of different method or different result for how to improve the justice transmission. But I'm just thinking for different stakeholders, they may have their own benefit, so they may consider different things. So what do you think for different stakeholders, and they may have a both bottom up and the top down thinking, and what do you think how to combine and integrate their ideas together and get a best that a win-win result from all these stakeholders by different thinking approaches. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Yeah, I think it is, there's no maybe prescriptive answer that this is the way that it should go. But I think that what we did find is that with different stakeholders who have different priorities and different approaches, they have to have a common vision that they co-create. So it could be a piece of legislation, or it could be, in our example of the Green New Deal for the Gulf Coast, that there's a common vision that they can then, that they both create, but then also are held responsible to. So you can have different stakeholders, but if you all agree to advance this common vision, then the common vision is what is advanced. That doesn't mean that stakeholders then don't do advocacy on their own in other capacities, which they often do, but that for the coalition purposes, that this collective vision that we have created is the one that we advance, and then that has to come from the coalition. It cannot be imposed top down. So that we found that the coalitions that co-created a common vision and a common plan were the ones that were successful, and that those that kind of came together because of funding opportunities or other reasons that were less organic and less from the ground up eventually fell apart and were not as successful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So another participant who raised their hand is the Benjamin Yang from Singapore. Pei Wei. So you can ask questions now. Okay.
Hey, Prasha, and thank you for your presentation and for sharing. Big fan here, so sorry if I'm not the most articulate right now as I'm fangirling. But two kind of questions from me. The first one is kind of following up on your previous discussion with Yenting on kind of local government interactions. I think one thing that a lot of people, whether advocates or activists, encounter in Taiwan when engaging with local governments is that they don't necessarily have the capacity, the human resources, or the know-how to kind of engage in these issues. Sometimes it's just not on their radar, or they just simply don't have the time or the headspace to deal with just transition concerns, or even just broadly kind of climate environmental policy stuff. So I was kind of wondering what that experience was like in your engagements with activists who try to engage local governments in the US, especially on not just state levels, but also like municipal, county levels as well. And then my second question is more on kind of the relationship between just transitions and kind of more deliberative and participatory democratic kind of processes. So one thing that I really, really appreciated about your research was, especially in terms of the Just Transition Listening Project, was the emphasis on the politics of listening and radical listening. And as I'm also thinking about institutional arrangements that can better yield and center kind of the visions and concerns and needs of people and communities that are most marginal and affected by both the fossil fuel industry and climate action and subsequent transitions. I'm wondering, in your view, like what role can deliberative processes like citizens panels or citizens assemblies that we've seen in France or elsewhere in the world can play in kind of delivering more just transition visions that are more connected to lived experiences on the ground. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for those questions. They're really important. So the first one is that it is very true that local governments don't have very much capacity. You know, I'm on the Los Angeles County Just Transition Task Force, and it is run by a city agency, and it is the task force members are largely either academic, civil society, or stakeholders. So one way that we've seen people get around it, and actually that the other side that conservatives do very well, is they do the work for the local government. So the conservatives have been very successful in doing this, that they will just write model legislation for state legislators, and then that just gets adopted. So there is some of this that there's just the reality that there is not that much capacity. I think it's helpful also to think about it as a capacity issue and not an ideology issue, that sometimes local government is not responsive because they just don't have the resources. And so the idea then is that there can be work that can be done by advocates that does the work for the local governments, such as the model legislation or model ordinances. And then in terms of deliberative and participatory processes, I think they're really important. What we thought about for the Just Transition Listening Project was exactly that, just to listen to what people had to say. I think there's a tension with academic research that often you have a question that you start with, and then you kind of do the research around the question. But our approach was just to listen. And we actually didn't have any research questions apart from what are your experiences with transition? And so what came out was really, I think, much more organic. And one thing that I always talk about is that, economists have this idea that people move to opportunity. They call it they say that people move to opportunity. So it doesn't really matter where you create jobs, that people will just move to the job. And what we found actually was that that doesn't actually happen, and that most people don't move because they live in, there's many reasons why people live somewhere, not just a job. And so because policy is made, though, on the idea that people will move to opportunity, that means that those communities and workers were left without any kind of resources because policy was made based on these economic principles. And so, we found that not having our own research question, apart from listening to what people had to say, came up with some really important findings that showed why there was such disparity amongst these communities, and also what their needs are. That what we actually also heard a lot about was a need for mental health support. That almost never comes up in Just Transition questions. That there was again, back to this identity question, and I apologize that it's so dark here now, but my light is across the room, so it will just be, I'm sorry. But what we heard was that, that it's not just, especially in a country that is so capitalistic like the United States, like when you lose your job, you lose your identity, and then there's just these spirals that happen. And there are almost no supports for that kind of trauma. And that doesn't show up, and even now, a lot of Just Transition proposals, they don't talk about the need for mental health or social, safety or any kind of community building and those kind of things. So, one, it's very important that these decisions are made from the ground up. But what we also learn from these deliberative processes, what we learn from citizen participation, makes us better decision makers and makes the policy that we create much better suited to actually help people.
Okay, so we are come to the final 5 minutes for the last round of the questions. So I will read out 2 questions typed in the chat box. The first one is from the Dr. Zhu Wenli. She also raised a question related to the Benjamin, the discussion just raised by the Benjamin. She asked questions about so we are talking about if we lose a fossil fuel job, it's not only lose the identity, it's also lose a good paying wage, and also some kind of like the local tax revenue. So since we have this situation, how to persuade the local resident would be willing to participate to promote the transformation when their career are locked in. And the last question, I think it's very suitable to conclude today's presentation is that this question is from the Yan Wanting. She working in a think tank. She working in a think tank. She asked question: is just transition necessary or optional? So I think that's a very good question to conclude today's webinar. Okay.
So thank you for these questions. So I think, of course, we have to think about the negative economic consequences that will happen as we decarbonize. But I think it's also helpful to think about workers as just more than their work. So people who work in the fossil fuel industry are also impacted by climate change. They also often have, in our discussions with folks, they are concerned about the climate, but they don't know what they're transitioning into. And so to me, one of the key aspects is really having it transition now. So we don't have 10 years to think about and do all the planning for what will happen or what industries will we bring. We need to start bringing industries now so that as you transition away from fossil fuels, there's as little economic disruption as possible. So what will take the place of coal mining? Once those industries are in place, you actually lose much less revenue when the coal mining goes away. I think the second point to point out here is that particularly for coal, this is already happening without any kind of just transition provisions. So coal in the US is already on decline, and those communities are not having any kind of transition assistance. So, again, I really think what we are transitioning into is very key to helping advance an energy transition. And then is just transition necessary or optional? Yeah, it's necessary. I think there are some people who think that climate change is caused by greenhouse gas emissions, and there are some people that think, like myself, that climate change is a natural result of the systems and institutions that we have now. And until we actually reform and change these systems and institutions, there will just be another thing. Climate change is just the latest. So a just transition is necessary because we have record levels of inequality and injustice. And history has shown us how much instability comes from those conditions. And also, again, my argument is that without these equity provisions, without transitioning to a more just society, you actually will not have any ambitious climate policy, because the opposition to climate change is based in people's materials consideration. So if you don't think about just transition, if you don't advance a just transition, it actually delays and derails climate action. So there is no possibility for greenhouse gas reductions unless we do a just transition.
Yeah. So that's a very important remark for today's webinar. So thanks for Minjun to spend with us for past 90 minutes. So let's give her a big hand virtually. So I will just hand over the event to Dolly to see if there's other reminder for the participants. Yeah.
What a wonderful speech, and thank you, Professor Minjun, again. Your excellent talk attract many participants to join us and have a wonderful discussion, interaction. Yeah, and thank you again. Thank all the members to join us. I think you will get my email regarding the next ECR short talk. Yeah. So if you have any question, you can contact me or try to contact Professor Minjun if you have any interest to do some, ask some question or do some collaboration. Yeah. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, just final reminder, we are talking about this is a just transition series. So that means we will invite other speakers other researchers who are also working on this issue to have a continued discussion about this issue. So stay tuned and to remember to subscribe to the Facebook page of the Future Earth and also the email list of the Future Earth Early Career Researcher Working Group. So that's all I want to say. So bye-bye and thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.